Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Ryan White of Rooted in Torah Ministries. This week we're on the Torah portion Reeh, which is Deuteronomy 11, verse 26 through 16, verse 17. And what we're going to do this Torah portion is we're going to kind of look at some different things here, just kind of jump around a little bit, and not really necessarily focus on just one section of it. What we want to look at is in chapter 13 about where God requires someone who is proselytizing for other gods, someone who is trying to lead Israel after other gods. And he requires them to be put to death. So we're going to look at the reasons why for that, and also look at specifically the punishment of stoning. Why stoning? Why not beheading or hanging or something like that? Why is it specifically stoning that is used here and very frequently in other types of death penalties in Israel? Why is this such an important way of being put to death? And then we'll kind of finish up by looking at what is called the sabbatical year, or in Hebrew, the Shemitah year, which is the every seventh year, the year of release, and how that interacts with everything else in our scriptures and understanding of who God is and everything like that. So let's begin by blessing our Creator, who's blessed us with this week's Torah portion. Amen? And let's try that again. All right. Baruch et Adonai Hamvarak, Baruch Adonai Hamvarak le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, ve'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen and amen. All right, so to begin with, we're going to start in Deuteronomy chapter 13, and we'll just start reading from verse 1 and look at what's going on here in the Torah portion. So he says, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or wonder, and the sign and wonder comes true concerning all that which he spoke to you. So this is someone who has risen up and said, this is going to happen, and it comes true. He's predicted the future. But even if it comes true, it says, and he then, concerning what he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods, whom you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of this prophet or the dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you, to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him, and you shall keep his commandments and listen to his voice, serve him, and cling to him. But the prophet or the dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has counseled rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to seduce you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge evil from among you. Okay, so what's going on here, and it's important that we understand the concept here. This is not just what we would call religious apostasy. We see this sort of thing going on in the Arab world a lot of times. If they have honor killings, in fact, if someone converts to Christianity or whatever other religion, the family will go out and put that person to death for religious apostasy. What we have going on here, if you were to look at it through superficial eyes and not really study the concepts going on here, you might come to that conclusion. We are dealing with the same sort of concept. But it's important that we're reading the book of Deuteronomy as a whole, not just taking one little isolated section and saying, okay, well, anyone who rejects the God of Israel is going to be put to death. No, that's not what's being said here. This is all within the context of a legal system. Remember, this is a suzerain vassal treaty between the God of Israel and between the people of Israel as a nation. And so as a nation, when they're living within their own borders, when they have their own constitution, this is their constitution. This is the way that they are to behave as a nation. They are not to allow people to come in, or people who are already inside, as we're going to see here in the next verse. In verse 6, it says, if your brother or if your mother's son, your own son or your daughter, your wife that you cherish, or your friend entices you secretly, saying, let us go after other gods, you're still to report that person, and they're to be put to death. Now that seems like a very harsh penalty. I mean, being put to death just because you're preaching another religion? That's not religious tolerance. How dare they? Right? That's our response from our society that we live in today. But we've got to realize that this is the ancient Near Eastern world. And realistically, this is the document given to the nation of Israel to operate within their own borders and their own lands. This is why, if a country like Saudi Arabia, if they declare themselves to be completely Islamic and they say anyone who comes in and teaches anything else shall be put to death, well, then they have the legal right to do that. We may not agree with that because we desire them all to be brought to the love of God through Yeshua the Messiah, but they have the legal right to do that because they are a sovereign nation. This is different than mob justice, where you're living in the United States and your son converts to another religion or your daughter converts to another religion, and so you have them put to death. Very different because now they're living in a different land, and the Torah works the same way as well. You look into the New Testament and the apostolic writings in the first century. You have a completely different scenario going on. Israel is no longer their own masters. They no longer, they had King Herod, but he's basically a puppet king. He's a vassal king of the Romans. And the Romans specifically did not allow the Jews to put anyone to death. And so what does Yeshua do? Yeshua teaches us, how do we deal with a situation where people commit an act of apostasy like this? How do we how do we deal with that? Because we can't legally stone them under Roman rule. Same thing with our lives today, living in the United States. We're not going to go out and stone someone because they come into our congregation and they're trying to entice people. No, now we go to Matthew 18 because Matthew 18 is teaching us how to deal with a situation when we are not in control of our own land. And that's where you go to the individual, you go take them with the elders, etc., the whole congregation. And you notice the whole congregation. You take them before the whole congregation, and if they still refuse to repent, then you shun them. You make them like the tax collector and the Gentile. You socially isolate them. In this scenario, where they did have legal authority to carry out the death penalty, they're stoned by whom? By the whole assembly. Everyone takes part in this punishment. So kind of some interesting parallels there, each dealing with a different situation. Right? Because in Yeshua's day, this is one of the things with the whole episode of the adulterous woman. Yeshua could not legally do that. He would have been violating Roman law if he would have cast a stone at her. Even though we do know there was cases of mob justice, right? You got Stephen and stuff like that. But those were operating outside the bounds of law. Those people could have been arrested by the Roman authorities had they chosen to take notice of that event. Only the death penalty could only be applied through the Roman legal system. Right? Does that make sense? So that's why today we don't do that, but we have Yeshua's example of how to take care of this person who comes in. And realize this is more than just an act of, I'm just going to change religions, or I'm going to teach Mormonism, or I'm going to teach Catholicism, or I'm going to teach, baptism, or Messianic Judaism, or Hebrew, all these different. This isn't someone teaching a different denomination. This is someone teaching a different deity. This is like someone coming in and teaching Islam or teaching Buddhism or something like that. Completely different. Now, we oftentimes, to us in the Western culture, religions have almost turned into different philosophies, and oftentimes it's kind of minimized the real change that happens when you follow another God. It's not just, yesterday I believe the God of Israel created the heavens and earth, and now I believe it's Baal. No, it's if you believe he's the creator of heaven and earth, you follow him. You live your lifestyle according to the way the God of Israel has dictated. He's the one who teaches us how human beings were designed to live. That's what the Torah is. It's an operation manual for the human body 3,500 years ago, right? Now, times have changed and we do update certain things, right? We can't keep the feasts in the same way. We don't have a temple, we don't have sacrifices, but we take the concept and we're able to apply it to today. We're able to keep Sukkot in a different way. We don't go to Jerusalem, or most of us don't go to Jerusalem because we can't afford it. We don't have a temple there, but we keep the essence of it, right? So that's one of the things with the Torah is that it's a living, breathing document, and that we do our best to keep the commandment with our modern conditions. Because times change and things have changed, and so we've got to be able to adapt, but still keeping the commander's intent there. Now, following another God says, I'm not going to do, I'm done with this. I'm going to live my life the way that this God tells me that the universe will run. Baal, he was a god of power. You always see him with his fist raised up. And the idea there is those who worshiped him, they believed that the way to live a happy life, the way to succeed in life, was not through acting out the justice and righteousness of the Torah. It was through oppressing people, through stealing, through taking, conquering. It's mine, I have it. I fought and I earned this through beating down everyone else. Whereas our God rewards those who are faithful to him. He rewards those who act with righteousness and justice and mercy, who take care of the poor, the widows, and the orphan. So coming in and teaching another, saying, let's go serve other gods, is more than just changing a religion. It's changing your lifestyle. It's changing the way that you behave, the way that you act. And if people are allowed to go astray, I mean, we see tons of examples of this in the Torah itself, but you look at the book of Judges, and clearly in the book of Judges, this sort of commandment was not being kept because they kept being led astray by these other gods. And what's always the result? They end up going into captivity and becoming enslaved to these other peoples, to the Philistines or to whomever. So you notice that, and look at what he says here. Let's go back to verse 5, and look at the words here. He says, but the prophet or the dreamer of dreams shall be put to death because he counseled rebellion, or we could also say treason, maybe a better word, because remember, the Lord is their king. Treason against the Lord your God, who, now, notice what he adds in here, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. So you see right there, just built into the structure of what's going on here, the concept of, I freed you from slavery. And the implication there is, if you follow these other gods, you're going to go back into slavery. And we know historically that's what happened. That's what happened in the book of Judges. That's what happened with the Assyrian exile. That's what happened with the Babylonian exile. They constantly violated this commandment, going after other gods and not putting to death the people who were demanding them or who were enticing them. And they'd go after other gods, and the end result was always slavery, exile. That's how God created the world to work. If you don't follow him, you're going to be put into oppression. Because these people who are idolaters, that's how they think the world works. That's how they think that power comes, is through crushing other people. That's how Kim Jong-un maintains power over his country. It's not through taking care of the widows, the poor, and the orphan. It's through crushing anyone who dares speak up, and not only them, but their family as well. In God's country, in God's nation, when they're planted in the land, they cannot allow this, because it's like a cancer, and if you allow it to start to fester, it undermines the system and destroys. The Torah is designed to work. The blessings are designed to work when the nation is following the Torah. It doesn't mean that if you yourself are keeping the Torah, but everyone else in the nation is not, that you're going to be blessed. That's not how the blessings work, right? We see this. I mean, you can look at Yeshua. Yeshua kept all the commandments, and yet he didn't receive the blessings. He received a death on a tree. Now, ultimately, he receives the blessings in the resurrection. We know that God will ultimately bring us to that blessing in the resurrection, when he sets the world back in proper order, where everyone is living that way. But if we want to experience the blessings now, it starts as our families, as our communities, and as our nations, right? It has to be all the people. Because if one is doing it and everyone else is not, that person becomes the righteous sufferer. And you see the contrast there between the nation being blessed and the nation being in rebellion, and the righteous in the rebellious nation end up suffering for the sake. And there's great reward in that in the heavenly realm, for sure. But We should always desire that all experience the blessings. Amen? All right, let's keep on going down here. I want to talk really quickly about the method of execution, because this is unique to the Bible. Unique to Israel. All the other nations, if they were going to execute someone, they would have a designated person, an executioner, or possibly a small group of people. And their ways of putting to death, we see in the ancient Near Eastern law codes, were drowning, burning, impalement, and beheading. They did not use stoning as a method of execution. Now that's interesting because there, the government is dealing with it, whereas when we read in the Torah, there is some interesting things that happen with this. I already mentioned the whole community. Let's look here in Deuteronomy 13, verse 9. It says, "But you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people." So the person who brought the witness, the testimony that this person was leading people astray, they have to be the one to cast the first stone. So this is serious business. If you're going to bring an accusation, you're going to have to be the one who carries out the penalty. Can you imagine that? It's not that someone else takes care of it. You yourself have to do it. "You shall certainly stone him to death, because he has sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and will never again do such a wicked thing among you." And so the concept here is that by all of Israel, by the whole community, obviously not all of Israel because there's a lot of them, but the community, the town or whatever, by all of them stoning this wicked person to death, think about what that does. Number one, that's going to eliminate, first off, if you're bringing the false witness, or if you're bringing the witness, and you're bringing a false witness, now you're the one who has to put to death an innocent man. You're the one to cast the first stone. So that right there makes you think twice. Not only that, but later in the next Torah portion, we'll find out if it's proven that you falsely testified, you're going to get stoned. Right? So it sets up a system where, I mean, they had to be absolutely sure that this is what needs to be done. This wasn't just, oh, well, we heard that he's teaching these things, so let's take him out and stone him. No, this was court of law. This is witnesses going on. This is a serious thing, because not only does the witness have to throw the first stone, but then everyone in the city has to throw the stone. And so this is a serious decision. This is something that the community is going to take very seriously. This isn't just a witch hunt, if you will, what we would call a witch hunt. This is serious implications here. And the other thing is that you there, imagine yourself, close your eyes for a second, and imagine yourself there in Israel, and your neighbor was just found to have been trying to teach people about other gods. And now you're there, and you have to take that stone and throw it. And you're the one who crushes his eye or something like that. And you see the blood and the gore, and you hear him crying out. And this image now is imprinted onto your mind. As God says here in verse 11, "Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and never again do such a wicked thing." Because you took part in this. You've seen, you've witnessed the ramifications of going after another God, of trying to teach people about another God. You're going to know there's no way. Even if I myself choose to go worship another God, I'm going to do it in secret at the very least. And more likely, I'm going to find a way to get out of Israel, because if anyone finds out I'm worshiping this other God, that's what's going to happen to me. I don't want that to happen to me. Right? It's an important means of teaching people. And we find this barbaric in our society. But realistically, unfortunately, we now live in a society that's reaping the results of this society where we just don't want to confront evil. We won't call evil evil. We just, they're just misunderstood. Coexist, right? And yet we're reaping the ramifications of that. We're seeing our young women being raped. We're seeing all this terrible things happening because we don't want to face evil and put out the evil from among us. We just say, oh, well, put him in prison. I don't want to see him. Take him outside, out of mind. No. In Israel, it was a community effort. as a community, we are going to purge Israel or purge evil from Israel. It makes a huge difference there. Let's take a little bit of a turn here now, and let's look at the dietary laws just really quickly. I'm not going to go through all these. You can read these on your own. Most of you who are listening to me here, you probably are very familiar with this. We don't eat pork. We don't eat shellfish. There's just things that, I mean, by the time you've gotten into it, at first it's kind of hard, but thankfully they've got turkey pepperoni or beef pepperoni, right? We live in a society where they've made alternate ways for us to eat. But oftentimes we get faced with shaming tactics, honestly. We get people, oh, you don't eat pork, and so then they'll go and they get a big, juicy, pepperoni pizza, or, they'll do something intentionally, or they'll try to mock you and make fun of you. Oh, I'm enjoying this pork. And a lot of times it comes from family members and friends. And what we don't often notice is that this is a method of shaming. And it's a very powerful tool, shaming is. It's just like, in high school, when you get made fun of for something, what would happen? You get embarrassed, and you wouldn't want to do that again. That's a method of peer pressure or shaming. And so they try to do that. And, we can argue till we're blue in the face about this with these sorts of people. But one just quick tip to consider is ask them about their kosher laws. Because as Americans, we've got kosher laws. Last time I checked, you can't go to a restaurant and order yourself a dog burger or a cat burger. You can't legally eat horse meat, right? Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's some legal way, but you can't sell horse meat at a restaurant, right? The United States has their own kosher laws. They're just not God's kosher laws. Now, God's kosher laws do include the United States ones. They say God doesn't allow you to eat dog or cat or horse either, but you understand what we're saying here. So for them to make fun of you because you're restricting yourself to what God says you can eat, but they will go ahead and they have no problem not eating what the United States government says not to eat, isn't that a little bit hypocritical, right? Aren't we free? Can't we do what we want? Why not eat human flesh? If Yeshua declared all foods clean, if that's really what it meant, we should be able to eat human flesh. Is that really what he was saying? Absolutely not, right? So sometimes we can just use a little bit of common sense on them rather than arguing countlessly or endlessly over these things in Scripture. All right? Let's go on, and I want to go to Deuteronomy chapter 15, specifically look at verse 10, I believe it is, here. Let's scroll down here. So in Deuteronomy 15, we have what's called the sabbatical year. Once every 7 years, there is to be a release. If a person falls into debt, they are to be released on the 7th year after they've worked for 6 years. And oftentimes this is kind of made fun of, and they call it slavery, especially because I believe the King James actually translated it as slave. The Hebrew word is ebed, which can mean slave, it can mean servant, but realize it's the same Hebrew word. And to them, what slavery was is not the same thing as what we think of as slavery today. We think of slavery today as with the African enslavement, where they went over there and they took people who had been captured and sold them into slavery. And these people, their children were born into slavery, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Or we oftentimes think of the sex slave, where young women and young men are abducted from their homes and they are enslaved. They have, they're given nothing. Even with the Egyptian slavery of the Hebrews, which was a terrible slavery, it's not even necessarily the same thing as what was dealing with there. From our best research that we can do, it's not that the Israelites were actually captured, right? They were already living in the land. They had been brought in. More than likely, when you study it out in depth, especially in the Hebrew and some of the extra biblical literature, it's more likely that these people were basically taxed into slavery, much like when there was the famine and Pharaoh ends up enslaving all of Egypt because they had to buy grain from him, and he ends up taking their lands and their cattle, and eventually they sold themselves. More than likely, that's how the Israelites become slaves as well. It's not so much that they were captured, it's just that they're taxed to the point where they have to work. And this is why they have a certain level of autonomy. You see that they live in their own houses, in their own villages, and they have their elders and stuff like that. But they are slaves. And that doesn't make it okay, but I'm just trying to explain the difference here. Now, in Israel, after they've been freed from Egypt, God doesn't completely remove the system of slavery or servitude. What he does is he institutes regulations on it to make it to restore the proper use of what really should be termed debt slavery. What that means is that when you fall into debt, there's now a way for you to honorably help yourself out. Because in today's world, if you fall into debt, what do? Well, now you're just stuck paying and paying, and people rack up credit card debt. They may declare bankruptcy. Well, if you declare bankruptcy, that's going to hurt the people that lent you money, and they're not going to lend you money. And then you're going to end up not being able to borrow money, and you're not going to be able to survive. So God has this system set up where the person, what they would do is they would say, oh, okay, I fell into debt. I fell $50,000 in debt. So I will sell myself to you as a slave. It will be for 6 years, no more. And at the end of the 6 years, at the beginning there, you pay off the $50,000, and now you're working for this person, and they're paying to provide you with housing and food. So now you're able to make a living while you're doing that. You're able to pay off your debt, and you're learning valuable labor skills. And then we get to Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 9, and it's very key here because he says, beware that there's no base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year is the year of remission is near, and your eye is hostile towards your brother, and you give him nothing, right? So you had to give him a loan, or you had to give him a loan. Sorry, this is where I want to go down to. When this person, this Hebrew man or woman, has been sold to you and serves you 6 years, on the 7th year you shall set him free, but you shall not send him out empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flocks and your threshing floor and from your wine vat. And so the idea here is not only does God ensure there's a system to take care of people who become impoverished and who need to be able to pay off that debt, to work it off, but he says once you're done with that, don't just send them out. They're worth so much more. You give them stuff so that when they walk out the door, they're able to go out and start making money so that they don't fall into the same mistakes again. Isn't our God amazing? Let's bless him for how amazing he is and how much we are just in awe of his mercy and his grace towards us. Amen? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chei olam nata betukenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha-Torah. I pray that you got a blessing out of this, and we'll see you again next week. Until next time, shalom.